Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the award winning Recovery Podcast, Get in the Herd. I am your host today, Nathan Mitchell, and today our special guest is author, writer, Ed. Ed, I'm going to say your name, and you're going to have to correct me here because I've been saying Kressy, and I realized I forgot to ask you this before the show. Is it Kressy or Kressy?
Kressy.
It is Kressy. Well, anyway, fantastic writer, Ed Kressy.
Thanks, Nathan. Appreciate that.
Um, and he's here to talk to us about his recently published book, My Addiction and Recovery. Just because you're done with drugs doesn't mean drugs are done with you. And I can tell you, I read I get a lot of books, and we've done a lot of authors recently. And I like this because I'm all about stories, and not only telling my own story, but hearing others and empowering others to tell their stories. So when I get into a really good, juicy read, I'm really happy about that. And so I can tell you, I picked this book up, and unfortunately, I didn't get to it until this morning. And I picked it up, and I'm like, wow, I'm in 35 pages, and then I kind of jumped around a little bit. But those first 35 pages gripped me, and I'll introduce Ed and let him talk about that. But man, I got to tell you, I'm looking forward to the rest of this book, Ed. So welcome to the show, my friend, and tell me how are things in Massachusetts.
Hey, thanks, Nathan. It's great to be here. Things are good in Massachusetts. We're getting into the winter time. It's a great time to be in recovery. I met John Shinholz. I met John, and I learned about the McShin Foundation mostly through my participation in a conference called Mobilize Recovery out in Las Vegas. And were you there, Nathan?
I was there this time. This year, yes. Not
okay.
The first one, but this year, yeah.
Okay, I was not there the first one, the first one either. But I guess you and I didn't get the chance to meet each other in Las Vegas. The point is, there's so many wonderful people, so many of our incredible sisters and brothers and supporters in the recovery community doing so much great work. There's, when I was in recovery, when I first got into recovery in 2007, I don't know if it was because of how recovery was at the time or just where I was at, but mostly it was the 12 steps. It was the AA and the NA, which saved my life. I'm so grateful for the 12 steps and the incredible people who sponsored me and who accepted me into the 12-step community. It seems to me like now in 2021 here in Massachusetts and elsewhere in America and maybe throughout the world, there are even more options for recovery. There's fantastic places like the McShin Foundation. There's Phoenix Recovery, which I know McShin is partnering with to incorporate workouts and meditation into recovery. There's just so much great work going on. So you got a Phoenix Phoenix mug. Fantastic. I got my Phoenix stuff sack around here somewhere.
Yeah, I've got one at home too. I take it to the gym in the morning.
And the point is, and especially a shout out to our incarcerated sisters and brothers who may be listening and or your supporters. There is getting to be more and more recovery in finding its way to the incarcerated community. We need to be doing better. We as the recovery community, we as a society, I feel, need to be doing an even better job of serving our incarcerated sisters and brothers, people who made mistakes like me. I made mistakes. I was incarcerated. Yet, we're a society that's about second chances. America is a place that's about opportunities. People like me and maybe like you, Nathan, who made mistakes, yet are dedicated to transforming our lives, are dedicated to service, as I know you are, Nathan, and I know the McShin Foundation is, with a special attention turned to our incarcerated sisters and brothers who are in recovery, who are doing such amazing work at overcoming their histories, at creating brighter and better futures for themselves, their families, and communities. I'm very grateful to be here with you, Nathan, and the McShin Foundation, especially in light of the work you're doing in the jail population out in Virginia there.
Well, thank you, Ed. And I'll tell you, I know we haven't met in person, and my story, my recovery journey begins in a McShin jail program just about 4 years ago, almost 4 years ago. And that was my first introduction to what something other than what I was doing could be. And you know, reading your book and knowing the little that I know about you, you know, I think, you know, some of the stuff, you know, we have the same DOC as well. Some of those parallels with me, you know, really resonate. And I'm reading about, you know, I was just reading about the your experience in jail with I want to say, was his name Deputy Horn, was it?
Good
And
memory.
yeah, well, well, because it's very vivid the way you bring that out, and how, you know, here you're in this, you know, situation where, you know, you have what is essentially an adversarial relationship, you know, the us against them, and you hear somebody who's actually reaching out and offering suggestions out of the for no other reason than because he wants you to do better, and you're actually taking those suggestions. You know, you took the suggestion to work in the kitchen and then to take the night shift. And then I saw what you did at the end there. You talked about where you went after that. And so that's kind of where I am in the story. And I'm kind of like, oh man, I want to read the rest. So I'm eager to jump into that. But, you know, tell me, you know, these are those moments. I have these very specific moments in my life, in my recovery, that I point at where I made a decision, you know, and I made a decision, and that's what launched whatever this and that, you know, and I guess I can look for that anywhere, right? But there's decision points where I let go, you know, in the language of 12 step, where I let go and I let God, but where I made a decision and I let somebody help me. And those are the big points in my recovery, right? You know, why was that moment so important for you? Why did you let this guy help you at that moment? And what happened from there? Because I haven't read that part yet. What's gone from there? I know where you are here. So,
Well, Nathan, it's several great points you touch upon. My most important decision, which you allude to, was my decision to turn things over to God, to seek my version of a higher power, to put spirituality as the number one priority in my life. That's my most important decision. How that manifested is, as you describe, when I was in jail, when I was arrested, at other points in my life, I was taught, I learned that if we are going to solve the incarceration crisis here in America, we have to do so in partnership with law enforcement. To me, it's a simple formula. It's like losing weight. If we're going to lose weight, we have to burn more calories than we consume. It doesn't matter if we like to exercise or how we feel about food. We have to follow that simple formula. If we're going to solve the incarceration crisis, which puts a terrible, terrible burden on our society, as we know, here in Massachusetts, it costs $70,000 to incarcerate one person for 1 year. I apologize, I don't have the numbers for the Commonwealth of Virginia, but I imagine it's probably roughly the same. $70,000 to incarcerate one person for 1 year. One hates to put a dollar figure on a human life because the incarceration crisis devastates individuals, families, and communities. If we're going to solve that crisis, if we're going to recognize the fact that 90% of incarcerated people will be released. These are people who will be living among us. We'll all be living together. They meaning incarcerated persons, and that, like me, I'm formerly incarcerated, and Nathan, you are too. All of us, along with law enforcement, are all going to be sharing the same communities. So, you know, we've got to act in partnership with law enforcement. What I learned to do was not to give a blanket endorsement to all things law enforcement. Okay, that's ridiculous. We don't condone every action ever taken by every person who's ever worn a badge. By no means do we do that. We know that terrible, tragic things happen every day in the name of law enforcement. That's wrong. We as a society have to address that. At the same time, in my opinion, we've got to recognize the good work that women and men in law enforcement are doing. We have to recognize the people like Deputy Horn. Deputy Horn, as you mentioned, was a character in my book. He was a sheriff's deputy who kind of coached me, who mentored me, who believed in me while I was incarcerated at one of the lowest points in my life. Here's a sheriff's deputy whose sworn job is to keep people like me behind bars. Yet we developed a relationship where I could look up to him. I saw in him someone whom I wanted to be like, meaning his life had direction. His life had purpose. My own purpose is different than a law enforcement person's. My own purpose is to serve our sisters and brothers who are incarcerated and turning their lives around. The point is, I overcame not only incarceration, I overcame a deep, deep, devastating fear and mistrust of law enforcement. I was in a place of methamphetamine psychosis. I selfishly consumed so much methamphetamine that I sank into a form of psychosis in which I believed in a vast FBI/law enforcement conspiracy targeting me because I had something to do with 9/11. Okay, this was my life. So in addition to the fact that cops had searched my home, cops had searched my car, cops had stripped me naked and locked me up in a padded cell, cops had incarcerated me into a psychiatric ward, all these things are true. And very importantly, it's because I brought it all on myself. Had I never decided to smoke meth, no cops would have ever put me in a padded cell or searched my car, probably. And on a side note, my experience is a little different, or it's a lot different. I'm a privileged white male, so society gives me unfair advantages. I'm not the victim of racial profiling like many people are. I'm not subject to the racism and prejudice that so many other people are subject to. So this is my lived experience plays in a little bit to the fact that I can honestly say it's my poor decisions leading to my getting addicted to drugs that led to all my interactions with the police and with and being arrested and being incarcerated. Yeah. Getting back to what we were talking about, I had every reason to hate the cops. I had every reason to fear and mistrust law enforcement. I believed in my psychosis, my beliefs were as real as this conversation we're having. I was absolutely certain that the FBI was putting pictures of me in Sports Illustrated to mess with me. I was absolutely sure that the CIA had put microphones in my computers and hidden cameras in the walls of my home and apartments. I was absolutely certain that the Department of Defense was following me with fighter planes. I mean, these things were very, very real to me. Yet, thanks to police, thanks to individuals in law enforcement, thanks to people in the FBI, certainly thanks to our brothers and sisters who are incarcerated and were incarcerated and shared their stories of triumph with me and inspired me, I overcame my fear and mistrust of law enforcement. And now I'm having overcome my fear, I'm using my unfairly privileged white male status to give back to society, to do something to help others the way so many remarkable people helped me. And that's why you and I are here talking, Nathan. That's why I'm so proud to have sent a number of my books to correctional facilities in Virginia, or actually I sent them to McShin, and you're using them in correctional facilities in Virginia. We've now donated over 1,000 copies of my book to correctional facilities in, I think, 11 different states, in about 110 facilities. We're serving, I think, 130-something thousand incarcerated people with copies of my book, donated copies of my book, because my book is going to correctional facility libraries, and theoretically, all incarcerated people should have access to their libraries and should have access to my book as a resource for recovery. Of course, in actuality, unfortunately, not every incarcerated person has the access they should to a library, but we're changing that. Amazing people like you, Nathan, remarkable organizations like the McShin Foundation, incredible people like your listeners, like your audience right now, remarkable folks like Ryan Hampton and the rest of the people, and Anna David and so many others who you and I met and interacted with at Mobilize Recovery in Las Vegas. We've got a long way to go, but we're climbing that mountain one step at a time, and we're getting to the summit.
Anna David was on the show 2 weeks ago, I think, with JD. What is JD's last name? She just finished her book. In fact, we've got a box of them downstairs too. I want to say Harmon. Oh, I'm so bad. I'm terrible. She was a fantastic guest. She had a great story, and I'm blanking on her last name. But Anna David was on the show, and we were talking about the populations that we serve through the show, and you were the first person that came up. So I thought that was kind of neat. But
nice. I love Anna. Anna's awesome. Yeah,
she is awesome.
Yeah, I love her. Yeah.
And it's a very compelling story. We talked about the beginning of her first book, which has a very racy component in the beginning there, where it's a very detailed, sexual exploitation story there. And I'm like, and even, I found that's very relative to my story too. And what I love about reading these stories and sourcing the beginning of my addiction, and you talk about this in your book at the beginning. You talk about your experiences, getting drunk at the wedding, going to Germany and getting drunk at the with the Stein that you kept for a while, and then meeting up with, what was it, your cousin again back when you got to California, and then meeting Victor and that experience. And then Victor ended up saying, you know what, I can't, this alcohol is not serving me, and I'm going to go to flight school, or wherever he was going. I guess you guys were talking about Top Gun back in the day. I'm a little younger than you are, but I was around in the mid 80s, and my father worked on F-14, so Top Gun was a big deal in my family. But when you talk about that experience and how Victor, who you essentially, I'm not going to put words in your mouth necessarily, but you talk about him like a best friend, but almost like somebody you idolize a little bit too. And maybe I'm misconstruing that relationship, but it was something that I always sought after. I'm the oldest of three, and I always felt that acceptance piece was lacking in my life too. I remember getting drunk the very first time I got drunk. And the very first time I got drunk was also with family, and subsequent experiences with family where I finally felt a sense of connection and acceptance. And I didn't know about that until, I'm 45 years old. I didn't know about that until I got into recovery a few years ago. I'm like, wow, going back, because I come from a family, where family is paramount and service is paramount. These are core values in my family. And yet there was still something in me that lacked, that feeling of acceptance. And I think that relates in so many of the stories of addiction and recovery and triumph and resilience, that relates to me and my story, that, everything else on top of it, the types of drugs, the where it took me, blah, 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 blah. When it all comes right down to that beginning part, that's where I feel like that's the incubator of what can we do right there. Yeah, we have to work on so many issues, but I love getting back to what is that and how can we work on making that what is the word I'm looking for? How can we work on that? Where can we go from there? And of course, I'm not a therapist or a psychologist. I'm just a guy who's trying to figure out my own experience through other people's stories, and I think that relates, because as I share my story and bring other people on to share their stories, I believe in that therapeutic value of one addict helping another. And so this is a beautiful way to do that. So, tell me, my friend, I didn't read further in here, so I don't know what happened to Victor. Tell me what happened to Victor.
Victor Victor and I are still close friends. We lost touch through the years. We got back in touch after I quit meth in 2007. Just to catch up the audience, you mentioned, Nathan, how the first time I got drunk was at a wedding, which is absolutely true. And I have to compliment you on your memory of my book. It's really remarkable.
It's a really compelling story, Ed.
Hey, thanks. I worked very hard on it. I wrote 26 drafts of that book. Not every draft starting from scratch, beginning to end. Some of them were just combing through and fixing parts, but I wrote it 26 times. So I'm very glad that you get something out of it. In the book and through the course of my recovery, I was taught to do something which you touched upon. That something is to examine the root causes. What are the root causes of my addiction? What were the root causes of my drinking so much and taking so many drugs that I ended up in psychosis and in homeless shelters and incarcerated in the psychiatric ward? Why would a person do that to himself? Well, there are different schools of thought and different reasons. What I learned was that all through my life, I hated myself. My dream since I was a little kid was to be an author, When I was a little kid, I would go to the library and bring home stacks of books almost too high to see over. So I love that escape into fantasy worlds. I just love the idea that I could do something like those writers were doing for me, that I could tell stories, that I could bring joy to people. I wanted to be an author myself. Ever since I was a little kid, I would write stories and little books. My proudest moments in school was one. I remember one time a teacher called me up to the front of the class to read aloud something I had written. I remember right after I finished reading, the bell rang, the class was dismissed, and one of the bullies who would punch me out on the playground, he came up and he clapped me on the shoulder and congratulated me and said, "Hey, that was a good story." And that was a time, one of the first times I learned that I had something to offer, that I could bring happiness, I could bring joy to others, that I could transform people's attitudes towards me and maybe towards the worlds around them. That was very important to me because I was a really awkward kid. I couldn't get along with cliques of popular boys and girls. I was very uncoordinated, couldn't compete in the gym class or athletic fields. It was very important for me to find that skill and that talent of writing. Unfortunately, I found something else that I felt very skilled and talented at. Nathan, can you guess what that something else was?
I see the end of the bottle there.
Yeah, I see. Exactly. Drinking, man. Drinking, and that leads to the person Victor you mentioned. And going back to root causes, I learned that my drinking and later my heavy drug taking was all about turning myself into a whole different person. That's what I was after. That was the root cause of my alcoholism and addiction. I was drinking and doing drugs so I could turn into a whole different person. I never wanted to be a high version of myself. I never wanted to be a drunk Ed. I wanted to be somebody completely different.
Wow.
And as we know, there's not enough booze and there aren't enough drugs in the world to turn us into a whole new person. We're still always going to be us. Yet we can kill who we are. We can kill ourselves. We can't turn into somebody else necessarily, but we can kill ourselves through drinking and through drug taking. That's what I was doing. Not intentionally. I never picked up a bottle or did a line of Coke or smoked any heroin saying, I'm going to die. I want to kill myself. Never in my conscious mind did I do that. But that's really what I was after. All through my drinking career, all through my drug use, deep inside, I was always that kid on the playground who was too cowardly to stand up for himself. I was always the young adult who told lies about himself, who lied to women, who lied about how he played football in high school. I made up all these lies about myself. I never played football in high school. I was always the kid. I was always the person who dreamt about being a writer, but never applied the discipline, never persevered, rarely ever set pen to page or opened up my laptop to do any meaningful writing. Always I was that person who was a coward, who was a liar, who was a thief, who was a failure. In my mind, I was always that person. I took more drugs. I drank more to tamp down those negative feelings I harbored about myself. Mostly those are feelings I projected onto the world around me in the form of resentments and anger. And, Nathan, I'm sure you know a thing or two about resentments, as many of us do. Getting back to Victor and others who I met along along my path. Victor was a young man who I encountered when I was 16 years old, who seemed to have everything. Great kid and a wonderful adult now. At the time when I knew him, he was 16. He was an athletic kid. He was intelligent. He was writing symphonies. He was running. He was a runner. I don't know if he was running marathons at the time. Just a happy guy who brought joy and energy to the world around him. I wanted to be like Victor. I wanted to be a whole new person. So I wanted to be like this guy, Victor. Victor drank. He drank heavily. I learned to drink too. If Victor had been a bank robber, I would have robbed banks. If Victor had been a car thief, I probably would have stolen cars. I don't know why I didn't pursue the other paths that Victor did. I don't know why I didn't write symphonies or become a runner. It was just the path of drinking and drug taking for someone like me. That was the way to tamp down that negativity. So when I said I don't know why I didn't, I guess I do know why I didn't pursue those other paths, because unlike Victor, who probably in many ways felt positive about himself, I felt a lot of negativity about myself. And that's why I never felt I was good enough to even try to write symphonies or try to write my book or try to become an author. Instead, I just took that easier path of drug taking. And as we know, Nathan, for addicted people, or as I know, and maybe you feel is true as well, drugs are never our problem, right? Drugs are our attempt at a solution. We take drugs to try and solve our problems. And the insidious thing is, as a solution, drugs work. Drinking works. They were my solution. I didn't feel hatred about myself when I was so high to feel anything. Drugs worked as a solution. I could interact with people. I could feel like someone of value. I could be that guy who rode a motorcycle with a little baggie of cocaine in the pocket of my leather bomber jacket and who knew where the parties were. I could be the person who knew the code words to use on the payphone. They still had payphones back in the day. I knew the drug dealers. I knew where they lived. I knew the code words. So I could invent this kind of superhero persona. It was a twisted form of superhero, because here I was doing drugs and selling drugs and doing whatnot. But drugs were my solution. I could transform temporarily into a different person, into this person who had value and worth. It was false. Of course, it was all false. And it led to intense psychosis. It led to periods of homelessness. It led to brief incarceration. It led to me hurting myself and hurting a lot of other people. It led to me hearing disembodied voices threatening to torture me to death. It just led to led to me toting a loaded pistol everywhere I went, because the conspiracies were after me. I mean, it led me to some very dark, very twisted places. The good news is, and it's very good news, when I got clean, when I quit meth in 2007 and put drugs behind me, I was shown a path to leading a beautiful life of spirituality, service, and self-improvement. As we were saying, people in law enforcement, our incarcerated sisters and brothers, and so many other remarkable people helped me along a path of becoming that author. Now I am an author. I write for the Washington Post. I make that sound more glamorous than it is. I have 4 articles, but still, it's the Washington Post, and I've always wanted to be an author. So, and the reason I'm in the Washington Post is not because I'm a great writer. Far from it. It's because remarkable people allow me to tell their stories in the Washington Post, and remarkable people like Victor allowed me into their lives, and so I wrote about them in my book. And now here I am today on the Get in the Herd podcast with the awesome McShin Foundation. And life's a beautiful thing. Somebody told me yesterday something which really resonated with me. She said something along the lines of everything's a gift. It's just some of those gifts come in very ugly packaging.
Do you remember? I had family members, and I actually thought it was cool at the time. But family members who used to wrap up Christmas presents in the newspaper comics. Back in the day, the Sunday papers would have the thick news comic strips in colorful. I thought that was cool. Anyway. I noticed the Washington Post. I saw that you just had an article published about Stone Soup in here, and I do want to ask you about that. But I want to tell you something too. What so much of what you've written about, and I relate to here. I had an older cousin, and he's he's my Victor. In your story, he's my Victor, and he played the French horn. I played the French horn. He studied German in high school. I studied German in high school. He went and got married and had kids and went to college and did all the other things. I decided that alcohol and drugs were my decision. That's where I went with that. And I did enjoy playing the French horn, and I love that I spoke. I took German. And, I didn't do these, like you were talking about how you were really into going into flight school because Victor was going, wanted to do wanted to fly. And sort of that was the thing you latched onto. I wanted to be like Michael, my cousin Michael, because he had the things that I wanted, which seemed to be popularity, ease, calm, sense of purpose, and all those things. I know him better now. I mean, we're still cousins, and we've gotten actually closer again. Years later. He just turned 50. I'm 45, and his kids are just going to actually, funny story, his oldest son is just his first year of college, and he's studying to be a pilot. That's a total separate aside. But I was incarcerated a few years ago, and in Virginia you lose our voting rights. As a felon, you lose your voting rights, and you have to petition to get them back. And it depending on who the governor is, it's an easier process than sometimes rather than other. For me, it was a very easy process. I got them once I got off probation. However, when I started in my position, I'm the outreach director here, and so advocacy is a part of my job. And so in 2019, when the Virginia General Assembly elections are always on an odd year, so we just had ours, in 2021. In 2019, the entire General Assembly, Senate, and delegates were up for re-election or election. And so I was out there a lot. And of course, our Congress, our congressional people were out, our federal delegates were out there, federal representatives were out campaigning for the local delegates. And I kept running into our congresswoman who represents the district I'm sitting in now. At the time, she was my congresswoman. I've since moved out of her district, but I kept running into her, and she finally looked at me quizzically one time. And she's close with John and Carol, but I was the new kid on the block who just got out of jail, recently, and I'm still on probation, so I'm a little. There's our congresswoman, and she had worked for the CIA, so I'm like, I'm scared of her. Yeah, and she came out. She kind of quizzically said, I see you everywhere. I was at a fundraiser about an hour away from here, and it was still her district. And she's like, why are you everywhere? And I said, it's because I can't vote. I have to make sure that my voice is heard, so I make sure that I show up. And she just kind of smiled and looked at me, and I could feel the wow in her voice. And at the beginning of this year, April or May of this year, I was at an event with her, and I raised it was a small business owner thing. There was like 30 of us, and I just happened to be there. And I raised my hand to ask a question, and the first thing I said was, "Oh, by the way, I got to vote for you last year." And she stopped, and she remembered the story. She knows why, what I said, and she told everybody there why I'd said that and shared that. And the fact that she remembered that, and then just what's today, Thursday? Just Tuesday, we got to interview her here on this show. For me, is like, wow, 4 years ago, I was deep in the deepest part of my addiction. And I was at that moment of, what, I don't know how to kill myself, but I don't want to exist anymore, kind of moment. I'm not gonna go kill myself, but I just don't want to exist on this planet anymore. And at that moment, I probably had a warrant for my arrest at that time. I was doing all the things that were on a trajectory to destroy my life, end my life, and I'm forever grateful that I got arrested that last time. And how can we make this better for the next person? How can we ensure that there are McShin programs or whatever programs in the jails? How can we make sure that books like yours that tell this story of redemption, regardless of where you came from, these feelings are the same. These feelings of, I need acceptance, I don't know what to do. Alcohol and drugs became that solution for me at the time. Well, now they don't serve me anymore. I put those away, and now something new serves me, and I serve something else. And I love that. I mean, like, those are the stories I want to hear. Those are the stories I want to tell. Those are the stories that I want to encourage and bring forth, because I can sit and go into a whole, drug-a-log or drink-a-log forever and ever and ever. And I can tell war stories and yada, yada. And some of them are fun. A lot of them are funny. But at the end of the day, it's like, I go home. I pay my bills. I go play with my nieces and my nephews and their dogs. I know you're looking to get a dog at some point. I saw that on the back of the book. And I think about life, and I'm like, man, I've had this really cool life, all these great experiences, and I still have to do some work. So I say all of that, that feeling of being in a place where, oh my gosh, I was in this pit of despair, and now I'm doing things I never thought I could do, or things that I always wanted to do. Like, I've studied theater in school, I go figure. And I was on stage, I sang, I did these things, and yada yada, and I loved entertaining people. It was the way I could connect with people without having to get close to people, if that makes sense. And now I can do that. I still get close to people now. I get close to people because I choose to. but I still am able to make those connections, and I can go back to where I got fulfillment. I found some kind of purpose way back in the day. I wanted to be on stage. I wanted to run for office too, but when I was a kid, I wanted to do everything, and I never really thought I could do anything. And now, I get to interview, you know, our representative, our congressman. I get to interview authors. I get to do something cool. I wrote two articles. They were what do you call those, letters to the editor last year, published in our local paper, but I was correspondent of the day twice last year, which was exciting to me. So I mean, hey, but I get to do all these cool things, and it requires me to look at why I want it, what I'm trying to do with my life, and where is my sense of purpose. And my sense of purpose is really not anymore about putting the drugs and alcohol into me. It's all about me saying, you know what, I am good enough. I do have a sense of purpose, and I can work towards that sense of purpose. I do belong here. I deserve to have these things. How did you finally get to that point for yourself, Ed? Because, when I look at that and I read what you're saying, I see so much of my story, which is so cool. I love that. I read my story and everybody's story, or I try to anyway. And when I read these stories of redemption, I'm always wondering, like, what are those moments? What are those moments? Like I asked you about the cop or the deputy. I asked you about Victor. I'm going to ask you about Dean in a little bit too. But like, what are those moments, man? Why do you continue to do this? Where is that? Where is that for you? Where is that fire that keeps you going? That purpose?
The fire that keeps me going, God. It all stems from God, from a belief in the spiritual. The way that manifests itself is very similar to you, Nathan. You said it very well. Telling my story. And it's so important that we, as people in recovery, tell our stories, I believe. Nathan, when that elected representative asked you why she saw you so often, you could have said any number of things. You could have said any number of true things that had nothing to do with your recovery or the fact that you're formerly incarcerated. Yet you chose to tell your story. You chose to disclose that you'd been incarcerated, maybe convicted of a felony for whatever reasons you couldn't vote. Look how powerful that story was. Look how much it affected your elected representative, and who knows how many other people she passed it along to, and whose lives are improved because you told your story, rather than not disclosing the fact that you're in recovery, rather than not being forthcoming about your being formerly incarcerated. You told your story. It's so important for us to do that. We talk about drug logs or drinking stories. Nathan, I'm on board with what you're saying. And when we use our drinking stories and our stories of addiction as counterpoints to where we are now, when we are very vividly in concrete terms and in abstract terms, paint pictures to our audience of where we came from, of the incarceration, of the addiction, of the terrible midnights of the mind, of the hopeless storms of self-doubt and suicidal thoughts and psychosis and whatever we went through, when we tell stories about how we ended up in a little flop house hotel with a sink in the corner where we'd ash our cigarettes, wash our clothes, and urinate. Like me, that's my story. When we tell those stories as counterpoints to where we are today, like you're doing, Nathan, like I'm trying to do, to being of service, to helping build bridges of trust between law enforcement and communities affected by incarceration. I myself, I was arrested by the FBI. I was also recognized by the director of the FBI with a community service award.
I love
That's a remarkable pathway. And it's not because I'm a remarkable person. It's because others shared their stories. People like Anna David, people like Ryan Hampton. I hadn't heard Ryan's story at the time just because he came along a little bit after I did. People like William Cope Moyers, people like Mary Carr, one of my favorite authors. So many people told their stories and they inspired me in small ways and in great ways. We tell our stories in the rooms of the 12 steps. We tell our stories in books and articles. We tell our stories on the street to our elected representatives. The more we tell our stories, the more we use our stories as illustrations that we can transform our lives, the more we prove to others that when we, as people in recovery, get second chances, we give back as much as we give, if not more, sometimes, because the people I mentioned, Nathan, you, Anna David, Mary Carr, Ryan Hampton, you all give back more than you were given. It's remarkable the work that you're doing. You've not only turned your life around, all of you, Anna, Ryan, you've not only turned your lives around, but you're making your communities better. You're making society better. When people hear those stories, when people hear our stories of recovery from the midnight, from the depths to the heights, to the sunlit mountaintops of recovery and service to others, more people are going to get opportunities.
Midnight's at the mind. I love that.
Yeah, more legislation is going to be passed. More books are going to be donated to jails. More McShin foundations are going to pop up and serve more of our incarcerated brothers and sisters. You mentioned the fire. What's the fire that drives me? Well, God inspires me to overcome my fear. God inspires me to persevere. God inspires me to get up every time I fall down, and I fall and get knocked down time after time after time. God gives me the strength and the passion to tell my story. God sends incredible people like you, Nathan, like everyone at the McShin Foundation, like Anna David, Mary Carr, and Ryan Hampton, and so many others. You telling your stories inspires me to tell my story. That gives me the fire, and that puts the goodwill, the recovery, that shines the light into the lives of many, many other people. And we heal our communities, and we make our children's futures brighter.
Ed, I appreciate, man, what you've said, all that you said there. And, you know, when we talked about you possibly reading a section from the book, and I'd like to give you that opportunity because, you know, well, my first thought, of course, is right to the first chapter, but I don't want to reveal the reveal of the first chapter because I think it spoils it if I try to reveal it or if you reveal it. But that's up to you. But if there's something in here you'd love to read, we'd love to hear from you, the book.
Yeah. I don't do a lot of readings. Not because I'm against readings or anything, but I did. I have a couple pages I'd love to read. The first comes from the time I served in county jail. It wasn't a tremendous amount of time because, again, well, we'll get into that in a minute. You're going to hear about a character called Two Jacks. Two Jacks is one of my fellow incarcerated persons in county jail. And then you mentioned I was on earlier, Nathan, you mentioned I was working as in the kitchen. Yeah. I worked on something called the midnight crew, meaning, you know, we would work like midnight or, 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. or whatever. So it was called the midnight crew. And that's where we're picking up in the book. Okay. So we're picking up right here. With the exception of Two Jacks and a couple others, most of us on the coveted midnight crew are Caucasian. Does this point to scientific evidence linking race to the ability to boil lobsters? No, it does not. As a Caucasian, I'm given unfair advantages on the outside of the jail walls, where I'm part of the majority, and unfair advantages on the inside, where I'm in the minority. As I get to know Two Jacks, who, if I didn't mention, is black, as I get to know Two Jacks and later other incarcerated persons, I begin to understand. When I was 14 and drunk at my aunt's wedding, I made two mistakes. I began succumbing to alcoholism, which led to drug addiction, and I began to engage in criminal activity. In our society, being an underage drinker, a drug user, defines one as a criminal. For my mistakes, I am eventually punished with those 60 days in jail. It's a punishment I deserve, to be sure. Yet in our society, others make those same two mistakes. They end up punished with far more time. Years, decades, lifetimes. My pathway was always going to be college, biotech career, home ownership. I had to work very hard to get off that path into addiction and brief incarceration. In our society, others have to work just as hard as I did, much harder in many cases, to get off the paths society puts them on into places like higher education and business ownership. Society gave me unfair advantages because of, let's face it, the color of my skin and my socioeconomic background. Now, these things, they sound obvious, but it's different when you live them. And I got a chance to live them. If it's okay, I'm going to read a couple more paragraphs.
Please.
I'm going to jump back to, this was the night that led to my incarceration. This is the night I got arrested. My arresting officer was Officer Pagano. And I actually ended up writing about Officer Pagano in the Washington Post. You can read a great article. Not great because I'm a great writer, but great because Officer Pagano is a wonderful person. And you can read about her in the Washington Post in an article I wrote. But we're starting. This is going to pick up just a few paragraphs. It picks up after I'd been arrested. I'd been addicted to meth for how long had it been at the time? However long it had been. It had been many years, 5 years at least. I got to the point where I had nothing left to feed my dog, nothing left to feed myself. I shoplifted hamburger. At the time, I was toting my loaded .357 because the disembodied voices were threatening to kidnap and torture me to death. I got arrested, and we're picking up when I'm sitting shackled to a steel rail in the Ingleside police station with Officer Pagano sitting to my side. Here we go. Tears stream down my cheeks. I can't stop them. Don't want to stop them. I once read an ex-junkie author explain how when you fall, it's always when you run out of money, not before. I've fallen all right. Why are you crying? Officer Pagano wants to know. There's a weird feeling she thinks it's because I shot someone. I'm not concerned. I didn't shoot anyone. No one will believe I did. I'm worried about my dog. It's the truth, no matter how idiotic it might sound. We'll take care of your dog, she says. Animal care and control probably picked him up already. She turns off the tape recorder, knowing she'll get nothing of value from me. She'd been, on the side, she'd been tape recording the interview about the crimes I'd committed. That's where the tape recorder comes from. Look, Officer Pagano says, I hope you get back on track. She leaves the room. I hope you get back on track. It's almost a throwaway line, but the way Officer Pagano says it makes me realize something. She cares about me. Insofar as she cares about human beings in general, and I, even if just barely, fit into that category. Ironic. The person who's concerned for the human race gives a burned-out criminal meth addict, me, the small yet powerful reminder of his own humanity. She wears a police uniform. It's a small yet meaningful lesson. From different walks of life, we can come together to improve ourselves. This is one of the first times, or maybe the first time, I realized that despite my fear of law enforcement, despite the terrifying reality that the FBI and the cops who were behind this global 9/11 conspiracy that was as real to me as this conversation we're having, Nathan, despite all of that, Officer Pagano, with those few words of compassion for another human being, she set me on a course that not only allowed me to overcome my fear of law enforcement, but to find ways to trust individuals in law enforcement, not to give a blanket trust to law enforcement, but to find individuals and to build bridges of trust between law enforcement and our incarcerated community and our communities affected by incarceration. It's a very polarized society we live in. We live in a highly polarized society. In few places is that more evident than the intersection between law enforcement and communities affected by incarceration. Yet a few kind words from a cop, a few words of compassion and empathy from Officer Pagano set me on a path where I'm playing some small role in building those bridges of trust, in ending that polarization and hopefully eventually ending the incarceration crisis and putting families and communities back together.
Yeah. I really appreciate all that you've just shared there, and I actually, I think we could go for another hour and a half just talking about the connections with law enforcement, because you're I partnerships with law enforcement, because I do think that is something that we're working on, that we work on. The way we build trust as an organization here at the McShin Foundation, of course, is to work with probation offices and officers, and work with the courts, and work with the system, a system that sometimes I actively advocate to dismantle. And yet I recognize the value, and we work very closely. I talk to the Commonwealth's attorney here in Henrico County, which is right outside the. In fact, we go to the same gym. That's a total funny aside. I talk to the Commonwealth's attorney in Richmond City on a regular basis. Her husband's actually my congressman too. We talk to the sheriffs. We have jail programs in the Richmond City jail. We go into Henrico County to help with. I forget the word. Deferment. Not deferment. The word escapes me. It's almost an hour here, and I have I'm starting to crash mentally. But we work with law enforcement too, and we have to. One of the greatest, we have to. But what I recognize, what you're saying to me, is that the humanization right there of the individual, that the people who are law enforcement aren't all set to just lock people up. That recognizing from their point of view what they're trying to do and what we're trying to do, there's actually quite a bit of crossover. We're trying to help each other, which is why so many, we work with law enforcement all over the Commonwealth here, in very, very red parts, very, very blue parts, because addiction, doesn't have a party. Addiction doesn't have a skin color. Addiction doesn't have a socioeconomic barrier. Addiction affects so many people regardless of all of those different things. So we work where we can, and we push to find those connections and those partnerships, and I really appreciate that. Man, I want to go for like another hour and talk about just that. But what I do want to tell you is I'm really looking forward to reading the rest of this. And I think, if you haven't yet picked up a copy, we don't have a link, do we? We'll put a link in the comments when we post it up. But, I highly recommend My Addiction and Recovery. Just because you're done with drugs doesn't mean drugs are done with you. There's a lot that we haven't gone into, Ed, and I know that we could talk more and more. I'm so fascinated by you and your story, and I'm eager to continue hearing your story as your story unfolds beyond the book. So I hope that you will come back and talk to us another time here. But we're at like 53 minutes, and I want to make sure you have an opportunity to say anything that you want to finish off with, man, because this has been really enjoyable for me. And I see Justin our pointing over there. That's where he is, our producer. He's over there just sort of riveted to the screen. So I know he's interested. So what do you got, Ed? You got anything you want to say to finish us off?
This has been great. No, I think you've said it all, Nathan. When you finish the book, well, I'll come back. I'd love to come back. You haven't gotten to the Boolean operators yet.
Just that little tiny bit I got in the beginning.
Okay.
That's what this sticky says right here, actually.
I think the only thing I'd love to say is just, this holiday season, think about those folks who are incarcerated. Think about people turning their lives around behind bars. Think about think about the efforts they're making, and also think about the cops out there on the streets who are protecting others. Think about the police officers who are putting their lives at risk. I'm not saying go out and endorse everything law enforcement. I'm not saying go out and endorse everything that every incarcerated person has ever done. We know people make mistakes. We know tragic things happen. But think of the good that's being done, both by women and men behind bars and by women and men behind badges. Think of the good that's being put out there. And the more we focus on the good, while still addressing what we need to address on the negative side, the more we focus on the good, the more good we get back.
I love that. Our guest today has been Ed Kressy. Thank you. He is the author of My Addiction and Recovery. He is a writer today, and he has been published in the Washington Post.
Thank you.
I love that, man. This is cool. I aspire to get into the New York Times and the Washington Post myself at some point. So we'll get there. Yeah, but anyway, so thank you all for listening. Thank you, Justin, for being here today and doing the work that you do, and for everybody out there. Take care. We
Hey,
will.
one more thing.
Oh, sorry.
I'm so sorry. I just want to thank the McShin Foundation. Thank all of you in the McShin Foundation for having me as a guest, and thank you so much for your wonderful work. You mean so much to so many.
Well, Ed, come back anytime, man. Next week, we have a really cool special on Tuesday next week at 2:00. We actually have a father and son pair. One is alumni, the father's alumni, and the son is a current participant. They're going to come in here and share their stories. And in fact, Ed, you'll appreciate this. The father, James, he actually found out about the McShin Foundation through our podcast. I know that's kind of neat, isn't it? We have a staff member here who we call them podcasts, but we get to see the videos on the tablets. We have another staff member here who found out about the McShin Foundation through these little videos that we do here. So that's kind of neat stuff. We're going to have them on Tuesday. And then on Thursday, we have a special 2:30 episode. It's a little later, just a tiny later. We have another author who's about to launch her book, and she's local. She'll be right here in the studio with us. I won't give her name. Her name is Mandy, but I won't give her full name because I want to let her tell her whole story from the beginning. So thank you all. Have a great weekend. Be safe. And Ed, talk to you later. Get in the herd, stay in the herd. Is that our new catchphrase at the end? All right. Get in the herd, stay in the herd.
Get in the herd, stay in the herd.
It doesn't fit. We'll figure something else out. See you later, Ed.